There is a war being waged for your soul that you barely recognize as a war at all. It does not announce itself with violence or drama. It does not attack with obvious weapons or visible enemies. It simply surrounds you with noise, constant, invasive, unrelenting noise, until you forget what silence feels like, what it offers, what it protects. And in that forgetting, you lose something essential. Not all at once, not in a way you can pinpoint, but gradually, imperceptibly, your soul begins to starve in the midst of endless stimulation. Your spirit begins to suffocate under the weight of perpetual distraction. Your capacity for depth, for contemplation, for communion with God erodes so slowly that you do not notice until one day you realize, I cannot hear him anymore. Not because he stopped speaking, but because I forgot how to listen. This is the silent war that Cardinal Robert Sarah has spent years warning about. Not the war of ideas or politics or cultural movements, though those exist, but the deeper, more insidious war against silence itself. The war that understands if it can fill every moment of your life with noise, it can prevent you from ever encountering the God who speaks in stillness, who reveals himself in quiet, who can only be heard when all other voices stop. Let me ask you something honestly. When was the last time you sat in complete silence for more than a few minutes? Not silence with music in the background, not silence while your mind raced with plans and worries, but actual silence, external and internal, where you were simply present, simply still, simply open to whatever might emerge in the absence of all other stimulation. If you struggle to remember, you are not alone. Most people today go weeks, months, even years without experiencing true silence. They wake to alarms and immediately reach for phones. They fill commutes with podcasts or music. They work in environments of constant chatter and notification. They relax with television or social media. They fall asleep to screens or ambient noise. From morning to night, their lives are saturated with sound, with information, with stimulation, and they call this normal. They call this connection. They call this staying informed, staying productive, staying engaged with the world. But Sarah would say they are dying, spiritually dying. Not because noise is inherently evil, but because a soul that never experiences silence is a soul that never fully wakes up to its deepest reality. A soul that never confronts itself. A soul that never encounters God in the depths where he dwells and speaks. Have you ever noticed how uncomfortable silence makes most people? How quickly they rush to fill it with words or music or activity? How agitated they become when forced to sit with nothing but their own thoughts? This discomfort is not accidental. It is the symptom of a soul that has lost its center, that has become so dependent on external stimulation that it no longer knows how to function without it. That has trained itself to avoid the interior depths where real transformation happens, because those depths feel empty, boring, or even frightening compared to the constant rush of noise. But what feels empty is not actually empty. What feels boring is not actually boring. What feels frightening is only frightening because we have become strangers to our own souls, strangers to God, strangers to the silence where both can be found. Sarah's message is both warning and invitation. The warning: the noise is winning. It is successfully preventing most people from ever experiencing the depth of communion with God that silence makes possible. It is creating a generation that knows everything about faith intellectually, but experiences nothing of it contemplatively. That can quote scripture but cannot hear God's voice. That prays with words but never listens for a response. The invitation: you can still choose silence. You can still reclaim the interior space that noise has colonized. You can still learn or relearn what it means to be still and know that He is God. But only if you recognize the war for what it is and make the deliberate, counter-cultural, often uncomfortable decision to fight for silence in a world that is doing everything possible to make sure you never experience it. This is not about becoming a monk or retreating from the world. This is about understanding that if you never experience silence, you never experience the fullness of your own soul. And if you never experience the fullness of your own soul, you never experience the fullness of God, who dwells there, waiting in the quiet, speaking in the stillness, revealing Himself in the depths that noise can never reach. The question is not whether silence is valuable. The question is whether you are willing to fight for it against an entire culture designed to make sure you never find it. There is a specific mechanism by which noise destroys the soul, and understanding this mechanism is essential if you want to resist it. Noise does not merely cover silence, it rewires how your mind works. It trains you to function in a state of perpetual distraction. It creates neural pathways that crave stimulation and find depth unbearable. Think about what happens when you try to sit in silence after living saturated in noise. Your mind immediately starts racing. Thoughts fly in every direction. Plans, worries, memories, fantasies, all competing for attention. You feel restless, agitated, desperate for something to occupy your mind. And within minutes, maybe seconds, you reach for your phone, turn on music, check your email, do anything to escape the discomfort of simply being still. This is not your natural state. This is a trained response. You have taught your brain through years of constant stimulation that silence is uncomfortable, that stillness is boring, that you should always be consuming content, processing information, staying busy. And in that training, you have lost something ancient and essential: the capacity for contemplation, the ability to simply be, to rest in presence without needing to be entertained, informed, or distracted. To encounter reality, including the reality of God, not through constant mental activity but through receptive stillness. Sarah argues that this loss is not accidental. It is the inevitable result of a culture that profits from your distraction, that depends on your inability to sit still, that needs you constantly consuming, constantly stimulated, constantly too busy to ask the deep questions that might lead you away from consumption and toward God. Have you ever noticed how the entire economy is built around preventing silence? Every business wants your attention. Every platform is designed to keep you scrolling. Every device is engineered to interrupt you with notifications. Your time, your focus, your mental space, all of it is valuable to someone else, and they are working very hard to make sure you never withdraw it long enough to discover what emerges in silence. But what emerges in silence is precisely what they cannot monetize and what your soul desperately needs: encounter with the transcendent, recognition of your own mortality, awareness of the gap between who you are and who you were created to be, the quiet voice of God speaking truth that cuts through all the noise the world wants you to believe. This is why silence is so threatening to the culture of noise. Not because it is unproductive, though by the world's standards it is, but because it awakens you to realities that undermine the entire system built on your perpetual distraction. Let me ask you something that might be uncomfortable. What would happen if you actually stopped consuming? If you turned off all the noise for a day, a week, a month? What would you discover about yourself? What would you discover about God? What truths would emerge that the constant stimulation has been successfully keeping buried? Most people are afraid to find out, not because they lack curiosity, but because at some level they know that silence will confront them with things they have been avoiding, things about their relationships, their choices, their spiritual state, things about the gap between the life they are living and the life they know they should be living. Noise is not just stimulation, it is avoidance. It is the tool we use to stay on the surface of our lives, never diving deep enough to encounter the uncomfortable truths, the unresolved pain, the spiritual emptiness that constant activity masks but never heals. Sarah writes about this with striking clarity. Modern people are not happier despite all their connectivity and entertainment. They are more anxious, more depressed, more lost than ever. Why? Because they have access to everything except the one thing that could actually satisfy them: communion with God in the depths of silence, and they cannot access that communion because they have lost the capacity for it. Their attention spans are shattered. Their ability to focus is destroyed. Their tolerance for stillness has been systematically dismantled by years of training in distraction. But here is what Sarah also knows: the capacity can be recovered. The soul can be retrained. You can learn to sit in silence again. You can rebuild your ability to be still. You can rediscover what it means to encounter God, not through noise, but through the quiet attention that allows Him to speak. But recovery requires recognition. You must first admit that you have been conquered by noise, that your soul is losing the silent war because you did not recognize you were fighting it, that the constant stimulation you call normal is actually abnormal. destructive, deliberately designed to prevent the very thing your soul most needs. Have you reached this recognition? Can you admit that the noise has taken more from you than you realized? That the price of constant connectivity, constant entertainment, constant stimulation is the loss of your interior life? That you are spiritually starving in the midst of endless content consumption? If you can admit this, if you can see the war for what it is, then you can begin to fight back, not with grand gestures or dramatic renunciations, but with small acts of resistance. 5 minutes of silence in the morning, 10 minutes without your phone, an hour without music or podcasts, a day without screens. These small silences feel insignificant, but they are revolutionary. They are the first skirmishes in reclaiming territory that noise has occupied for years. They are the beginning of remembering what it feels like to simply be present, to encounter yourself, to make space for God to speak. And in that space, that quiet, uncomfortable, initially boring space, something begins to happen. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually you begin to hear again. Not with your ears, with your soul. The voice you forgot was there, the presence you stopped noticing, the God who has been speaking all along but could not be heard over the noise you kept filling your life with. This is what the silent war is about. Not whether you will have noise in your life. You will, you must, the world requires it. But whether noise will have all of your life, whether it will colonize every moment, dominate every space, prevent every encounter with the depths where God dwells and speaks. Sarah is calling you to fight, not against people or technology itself, but against the tyranny of noise, against the culture that wants you distracted, superficial, too busy to ever dive deep, against the forces, both external and internal, that profit from your inability to be still. And the fight begins with a single choice: to create space for silence, to protect it, to defend it against the 1,000 intrusions that will try to fill it, to sit in it even when it feels uncomfortable, boring, pointless, trusting that what feels like nothing is actually the doorway to everything your soul has been seeking. There is a particular illusion that noise creates, and this illusion is perhaps its most dangerous weapon: the illusion of connection, the illusion that by consuming endless information, by staying constantly connected to news and social media and messaging, by always being available and always being informed, you are somehow more engaged with reality, more connected to others, more alive to the world. But Sarah reveals this as the lie it is. You are not more connected. You are more fragmented, not more engaged, more distracted, not more alive, more numb to actual presence because your attention is scattered across 1,000 digital interactions that simulate connection while preventing actual communion. Have you ever been in a room full of people where everyone is on their phones, physically together but mentally absent, or had a conversation with someone who is half listening because they are also checking messages, or found yourself unable to give your full attention to the person in front of you because your mind is already planning the next thing, or replaying the last thing, or wondering what you are missing online? This is the fragmentation noise produces. It creates the illusion of multitasking, of efficiency, of staying on top of everything. But what it actually creates is a person who is fully present to nothing, who skims the surface of 1,000 interactions but never goes deep with anyone, who knows about many things but understands few things, who is always busy but rarely productive in ways that truly matter. And this fragmentation does not just affect your relationships with other people, it affects your relationship with yourself. You cannot know yourself if you never spend time with yourself. You cannot hear your own soul if you never create silence for it to speak. You cannot discern your deepest desires, your truest calling, your authentic self if you are constantly drowning out your interior voice with external noise. Let me ask you honestly, do you even know what your soul is saying anymore? If you stripped away all the voices you consume, the podcasts, the news, the social media, the entertainment, would you recognize your own thoughts, your own desires? Or have you become so accustomed to letting external voices fill your mind that you have lost touch with your own interior life entirely? This loss is catastrophic for the spiritual life, because Christianity is not primarily about external practice or intellectual belief. It is about interior transformation, about the slow work of allowing God to reshape your heart, your desires, your very self. And that work happens in silence, in the interior space where God speaks and you learn to recognize his voice, distinct from all the other voices clamoring for your attention. But if that interior space does not exist, if noise has colonized it completely, then the work cannot happen. You can participate in all the external forms of religion, attend services, recite prayers, follow rules. But without the interior depth that only silence cultivates, it all remains external. It never penetrates to the level where actual transformation occurs. Sarah sees this everywhere in modern Christianity. People who know all the doctrines but have never encountered the living God. People who perform all the practices but experience none of the presence. People who are externally religious but internally empty because they have never created the silence necessary for God to fill them. Have you experienced this hollowness? This sense that your faith is mostly performance? That you go through the motions but rarely feel the reality behind them? That prayer is words you say rather than communication you experience. If so, the problem is not your faith or your effort or your sincerity. The problem is noise. You are trying to build an interior life while allowing noise to prevent interiority itself. You are trying to hear God while drowning out his voice with constant stimulation. You are trying to be contemplative while training yourself to be perpetually distracted. It cannot work. Not because God is distant or unwilling, but because you have made yourself unavailable to the kind of encounter he offers. You are like someone trying to have a deep conversation in a nightclub, wondering why communication is so difficult, while refusing to step outside where actual dialogue could occur. The invitation is to step outside, to leave the noise, not forever. You live in the world and must engage it, but regularly, daily, creating protected spaces where silence reigns and God can speak, and you can actually hear. But here is where most people fail. They try to create this space while still carrying the noise with them. They sit down to pray, but their phone is within reach. They carve out quiet time, but let their minds continue racing with plans and worries. They make space externally, but not internally. True silence requires both: external quiet, the absence of noise around you, and internal quiet, the stilling of the noise within you. The training of your mind to stop its constant chatter, its endless planning and reviewing and worrying, and simply be present to the moment, to yourself, to God. This internal quiet is harder than external quiet, because external noise you can escape. Internal noise follows you everywhere. It is the product of years of training in distraction, years of filling every spare moment with mental activity, years of never allowing your mind to simply rest. But it can be retrained, slowly, with practice, by repeatedly returning to silence even when your mind rebels, by gently redirecting your attention when it wanders, by building the muscle of presence through small, consistent acts of simply being still. Sarah offers practices for this: Lectio Divina, contemplative prayer, simply sitting in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament without agenda or words. These are not techniques to master, but postures to inhabit, ways of being that gradually reshape how your mind works, how your soul attends, how you relate to God. But they require time. They require patience. They require the willingness to feel uncomfortable, bored, unproductive by the world's standards. They require believing that this apparent nothingness is actually the doorway to everything that matters. Let me ask you, are you willing to invest that time, to endure that discomfort, to resist the pull back to noise long enough to discover what silence actually offers? Most people are not. They try silence for a few minutes, find it difficult or unrewarding, and return to the familiar comfort of noise. They conclude that silence is not for them, that they are not contemplative types, that maybe this works for monks, but not for normal people living normal lives. But this conclusion is exactly what the culture of noise wants you to reach. It wants you to believe that silence is unrealistic, impractical, optional, that you can live a full spiritual life while remaining perpetually distracted. That depth is available without ever diving deep. It is a lie, and Sarah knows it. He has seen both the emptiness that noise produces and the fullness that silence offers. He has witnessed souls dying of spiritual starvation in the midst of endless consumption. And he has witnessed souls coming alive through the simple practice of learning to be still. The choice is yours. Continue in the noise and accept the slow erosion of your interior life, or fight for silence, knowing the fight will be difficult, but believing that what you will find in the quiet is worth more than everything the noise promised, but never delivered. This is the silent war, and your soul is losing. Not because the enemy is too strong, but because you have not yet recognized you are fighting. The moment you recognize it, the moment you see noise for what it is and choose silence for what it offers, the war begins to turn. Not quickly, not easily, but truly. And in that turning, you begin to recover what you did not even realize you had lost: yourself, your depth, your capacity for presence, and the God who has been waiting in the silence all along. There is a moment that comes to everyone who begins to practice silence seriously. It is the moment when you realize how addicted you have become to noise. Not intellectually, you might have known this abstractly, but viscerally, in your body, in your nervous system, in the sheer agitation you feel when you try to sit still. You sit down to pray, you create external silence, you close your eyes, and immediately your body revolts, your leg wants to shake, your fingers want something to fiddle with. Your mind starts generating tasks you absolutely must do right now. You feel an almost physical pull toward your phone, toward doing something, toward filling the silence with anything other than silence itself. This is withdrawal. Like any addiction, the addiction to noise produces withdrawal symptoms when you try to quit: restlessness, anxiety, the overwhelming sense that you are wasting time, that you should be doing something productive, that this silence is pointless, and you need to get back to the noise where you feel more in control, more productive, more alive. Have you experienced this? Have you tried to pray and found yourself counting the minutes, eager for it to be over, so you can get back to your phone, your work, your distractions? Have you started a silent retreat only to spend the entire time fighting the urge to leave, to check messages, to do anything except sit with the uncomfortable reality of your own interior state? This discomfort is not a sign that silence is wrong for you. It is a sign of how deeply noise has colonized your soul. It is a sign of how dependent you have become on external stimulation to manage your internal state. It is a sign that the silent war has been going on longer than you realized and has conquered more territory than you knew. But here is what Sarah would tell you. This discomfort is not permanent. It is the necessary passage through which you must walk to reach the peace on the other side. It is the detox your soul must undergo to recover its natural capacity for stillness, for presence, for communion with God. Most people quit during this phase. They conclude that silence does not work for them, that they are too restless, too busy-minded, too modern for contemplative practices. They return to the noise, relieved to escape the discomfort, convinced that they gave it a fair try, and it simply is not their path. But what they do not realize is that the discomfort is not failure. It is progress. It is the death throes of the addiction. It is proof that something is happening, that noise is losing its grip, that your soul is beginning to remember what it was created for. The question is whether you will endure long enough to reach the other side, whether you will sit through the restlessness without giving in, whether you will return to silence day after day, even when it continues to feel uncomfortable, boring, unproductive. Let me ask you something. What would happen if you committed to just 15 minutes of silence every day for 30 days, not hoping for immediate results, not expecting profound experiences, just faithfully showing up, sitting still, resisting the pull back to noise? What would happen is this. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the addiction would weaken, the agitation would lessen, the desperate need for constant stimulation would begin to fade. And in the space that opens, something else would emerge. Something quieter, something deeper, something that has been there all along, but was buried under layers of noise. You would begin to hear yourself again, your actual thoughts, not just the recycled content you have been consuming, your actual desires, not just the desires advertising has created in you, your actual soul, with its longings and wounds and questions and profound need for God, and you would begin to hear God again, not in dramatic revelations necessarily, but in gentle promptings, in quiet clarity, in the peace that comes not from having all the answers, but from resting in the presence of the one who does. This is what Sarah means when he speaks of the power of silence. Not that silence is magic, not that it automatically produces mystical experiences, but that silence creates the conditions in which the soul can wake up, can become aware, can attend to realities that noise keeps perpetually obscured. But the culture of noise does not want you to wake up. It needs you asleep, distracted, perpetually consuming. It needs you convinced that silence is boring, that stillness is wasteful, that you should always be productive, always be informed, always be connected. And it has powerful weapons, algorithms designed to keep you scrolling, devices engineered to be addictive, social structures that normalize constant availability and penalize disconnection, economic systems that depend on your perpetual consumption. You are fighting against all of this when you choose silence, not just your own habits, but an entire civilization designed to prevent exactly what you are trying to do. This is why Sarah calls it a war, because it is a war. And you are fighting against an enemy that is patient, sophisticated, and deeply invested in your defeat. An enemy that understands that if it can keep you distracted long enough, you will never wake up to the depth available in silence. You will never encounter the God who speaks in stillness. You will never become the person you were created to be. But here is the hope. The enemy is powerful but not omnipotent. Noise is pervasive but not inescapable. You can still choose silence. You can still create protected spaces where noise does not reign. You can still train yourself to resist the pull of constant stimulation. It will be difficult. The withdrawal will be uncomfortable. The voices telling you that you are wasting time will be loud. The temptation to return to the familiar comfort of noise will be constant. But on the other side of that difficulty is something the culture of noise can never give you: yourself. Your full, deep, authentic self. The self that exists beneath all the conditioning and consumption. The self that God created and loves and is calling to communion. And beyond yourself, God himself. Not the God you learn about through books or podcasts, but the God you encounter in the depths of silence. The God who cannot be known through information, but only through presence. The God who has been waiting in the quiet all along, speaking words that can only be heard when all other voices stop. This is what you are fighting for. Not an abstract ideal. Not a spiritual luxury for those with extra time, but the very core of your humanity. The depth that makes you fully alive. The communion that satisfies the hunger nothing else can touch. Sarah has seen what happens to souls that never find this depth. He has seen the despair, the restlessness, the profound dissatisfaction that comes from living perpetually on the surface. And he has seen what happens to souls that do find it, the peace, the clarity, the joy that comes from finally coming home to themselves and to God. The question is, which you will choose. Will you continue in the noise, losing ground every day in a war you barely recognize you are fighting? Or will you begin today to reclaim silence, to protect it, to practice it even when it feels pointless? The silent war continues. Your soul is losing, but the war is not over. You can still choose to fight. You can still create space for silence. You can still learn to be still and know that He is God. The choice is yours, and it begins with the next 15 minutes. Turn off the noise. Sit in silence, endure the discomfort, and discover what emerges when you finally create space for the God who has been speaking all along, waiting for you to stop talking long enough to hear.